Something is happening in Las Vegas, and I don't mean that in a vague, hype-driven way. I mean it in the specific, concrete, this is actually different way that you only recognize when you've watched enough NFL rebuilds fall apart to know what a real one looks like versus what a performed one looks like. I've been sitting with some footage from inside the Raiders organization, watching the offseason unfold from the inside out, and what I came away with wasn't what I walked in expecting. This wasn't a hype reel. This wasn't a franchise selling you on a vision they haven't earned yet. What it actually was a documentation of how a team that hit absolute rock bottom quietly and methodically rebuilt itself in the span of a single offseason. And the more I sit with it, the more I think the rest of the AFC has no idea what's coming. Let me give you the foundation first, because the context is everything here. The Raiders finished last season with the worst record in the entire NFL. Not bad. Not disappointing. Dead last. And I want you to understand what that kind of result does to a franchise internally, because from the outside, it just looks like a number in the standings column. From the inside, it's fractures. It's the ownership asking hard questions of the front office asking hard questions of the coaching staff, the veteran players quietly calculating whether their time here is done. Losing at that level has a gravity to it. It pulls everything toward collapse. And plenty of organizations have spent the better part of a decade trapped in exactly that cycle, rotating through quarterbacks and head coaches, while the real problem, the one nobody wants to say out loud, goes completely unaddressed. The Raiders didn't do that. And I think that's the first important thing to understand about what's actually unfolding here. What they did instead was walk out of the wreckage holding the #1 overall pick for the first time since 2007. Nearly 2 decades since this franchise had that kind of leverage going into a draft. And what struck me, watching the footage from inside the building during this period, was the energy around that pick. There was none of the relieved exhale you sometimes see when a struggling organization lands a premium selection. No sense of, well, at least we got something out of that disaster. The feeling was closer to a group of people who understood precisely what this moment represented. A genuine architectural reset, the kind of opportunity that almost never comes twice, and we're treating it with the weight it actually deserved, rather than the weight it was comfortable to assign it. Now, I want to slow down on the coaching hire, because this is where I think the Raiders made a decision that deserves significantly more credit than it received when it happened. When that search opened up, the name dominating every conversation publicly was Cliff Kingsbury. He was the headline, the obvious candidate, and I get the logic. Kingsbury has a real offensive pedigree. His most recent head coaching tenure ended in circumstances complicated enough to generate genuine sympathy in league circles, and there was a reasonable argument that a fresh environment could unlock a different version of what he's capable of. The conversation around him was legitimate, but the actual story, the one that tells you something real about this front office's priorities, was convincing Clint Kubiak to leave the path he was already on. Think about where Kubiak was standing when Las Vegas came calling. He had just finished coordinating an offense through a Super Bowl appearance. That is the single most valuable credential a coordinator can carry in this league. His phone was ringing. Teams with competent quarterbacks already in place, offensive lines already built, receiver rooms with actual weapons and windows already open, those calls were coming in. The conventional version of Clint Kubiak's next step would have had him walking into a comfortable opportunity and building from a position of existing strength. That's the safe play. That's the move that protects your record and keeps you in the conversation for the next job after that. He said no to all of it. He chose to walk into a building that had just finished last in the entire NFL, with no established quarterback, no recent winning culture to lean on, in a division that has real competition and no margin for slow development. He chose to bet on a front office's unproven vision and on his own ability to construct something from the ground up instead of inheriting something somebody else already built. I've watched enough coaches make this kind of choice to know that there are really only 2 outcomes on the other side of it. You become a legend, or you become a cautionary tale. There's almost nothing in between. Kubiak knew that, and he chose it anyway. That tells me more about what kind of coach he is than any scheme he's ever drawn up on a whiteboard. What also came through clearly in the footage was what the people running this franchise were specifically looking for in that search. They didn't want someone who would come in and manage perception. They weren't looking for the candidate who would walk into a press conference and tell the market everything was already trending upward. What they valued, and this is the part that surprised me the most, was honesty about how bad things actually were. Candor about the real gap between where this organization stood and where it needed to go. That might sound straightforward, but I want you to think about how unusual it actually is to walk into an interview for a head coaching job and be valued for your willingness to name the problems rather than paper over them. Most coaching searches reward confidence and optimism because that's what the room instinctively wants to hear. The fact that this front office specifically filtered for the opposite tells you something real about the organizational philosophy they're trying to build. Now let me get into the draft, because this is where the front office's work becomes genuinely impressive from a roster construction standpoint, and it's something that got significantly less analytical attention than it deserved when it was happening in real time. Las Vegas entered this cycle with 10 total selections. 2 picks in the early portion of the first round, including the 4th overall, a late 3rd, 3 separate 4th-round picks, 2 sixths, and a 7th. That kind of volume is unusual, and what unusual volume gives you is something most teams never actually get to experience: margin for error. When you're building a draft class with that much capital, you're not dependent on any single selection carrying the entire thing. You can afford a swing that doesn't connect because you've already got something sitting behind it. You're populating multiple levels of the depth chart at the same time rather than praying that 2 or 3 premium picks somehow trickle value all the way down the roster. But capital without evaluation infrastructure is just opportunity you haven't learned to use yet. And this is the detail I think gets the least attention. The Raiders expanded their scouting department specifically heading into this cycle, added evaluators, widened the prospect net. And I know that doesn't sound dramatic, but after following rebuilds for as long as I have, the organizations that actually turn the corner are almost always the ones who invested in the invisible infrastructure before it was urgently necessary. The people sitting in gyms during All-Star weekends, filing character reports, cross-checking medical histories, building the kind of file on a prospect that shapes how you spend 18 minutes in a combine room. That work doesn't generate headlines, but it generates the difference between a draft class that becomes a genuine foundation and one that looks good in April and quietly disappoints through the first 3 years of contracts. And then you get to the combine itself, and this is where the footage shifts character entirely, because everything up to this point was structure, front office mechanics, organizational philosophy. The combine is where it becomes human. The number 1 overall pick walks into that room, and I want you to sit with what that moment actually feels like from both sides of the table. On one side, you have a group of evaluators who have spent months preparing for this specific conversation. They know which questions they're asking. They know what they're listening for underneath the answers. They have a shared language around the traits they've identified as non-negotiable. On the other side, you have a 21-year-old quarterback who knows, with complete clarity, that every word he says over the next 18 minutes is going to be dissected by people who control the entire arc of his professional life. That's not a gentle pressure. Most prospects manage it by getting slightly smaller, slightly more careful, slightly more rehearsed, the performance of confidence rather than the actual thing. That didn't happen here. What came through in his portion of the footage was a quarterback who walked in with his actual background, who started at a smaller program, who had to earn credibility at each level rather than arriving with a predetermined path, and presented it not as a hardship story designed to generate sympathy, not as a performance of resilience, just as the factual context of how he developed. There is a specific composure that comes from years of having to convince skeptics. It's different from the composure that comes from being handed the franchise quarterback label before you've taken a meaningful snap. Both paths can produce elite players, but the ones who've had to fight for legitimacy tend to understand what it costs to keep it once you have it. And that understanding shows up in ways that don't register on a measurable, but absolutely show up in the 4th quarter of a December game when the margin has disappeared. The piece of his conversation that I keep returning to is how he talks about communication. He acknowledges directly, without being prompted, that the version of himself that some people formed an opinion about, based on a specific viral moment, a sideline reaction during a tough loss that became a talking point about his temperament and emotional regulation, isn't who he actually is. And then, instead of just saying that and expecting it to land, he describes what he did about it. He took speech classes. He studied frameworks for leadership communication. He deliberately went looking for methodology that would help him connect with different personality types in a professional locker room, because he understood that raw talent earns you a roster spot and leadership earns you a team. Those are not the same thing, and not every 21-year-old quarterback understands the distinction yet. That level of intentionality is rare. Not rare in the way that gets used loosely to describe someone slightly above average. I mean genuinely uncommon. The kind of self-awareness that leads a prospect to identify a specific gap in how he's perceived publicly, and then take concrete, structured steps to close that gap before it follows him into a professional locker room that almost never shows up at this age, and it doesn't show up in any combine measurable. It doesn't get captured in a completion percentage or a 40 time. But it shows up in a franchise quarterback's ability to hold a team together when things get difficult, which is ultimately the only environment that actually tests whether a quarterback is real. Someone in the footage makes an offhand comment that he sounds almost scripted because of how deliberate and composed his communication has become. His response to that is the one I keep coming back to, because it's more self-aware than most veterans I've heard talk about themselves. He says the people who know him, the teammates who are in the room with him, when there's nothing to perform for and no camera creating any kind of context, those people don't see it that way. The gap between the public perception shaped by a moment that got clipped and shared out of context and the private reality his teammates actually experience is something he's thought about carefully. That's not a deflection. That's a quarterback who understands the difference between reputation and character, and who has made a conscious decision about which one he's actually going to build. The Pro Day added another layer to this. He didn't throw at the combine, held everything back, made every team that wanted to evaluate his arm talent wait for his own environment, his own conditions, his own moment, and then he showed up at his Pro Day and took command of that field from the opening snap. The cynical read is that he was protecting himself from an environment he couldn't fully control. Maybe. But the way people inside the building described watching it, it felt less like calculated risk management and more like a quarterback who has developed a very clear sense of when to perform and when to wait. Quarterbacks who understand timing as a concept in the pocket often understand it off the field too, because the instinct comes from the same place. You don't force the throw before the window opens. You wait for the moment, and when it arrives, you don't hesitate. I also want to address the defensive side of what the Raiders built in this draft, because a franchise quarterback doesn't win games alone, and the roster construction work extends well beyond the top pick. Las Vegas was deliberate about adding physical edge throughout this class, and some of the evaluation conversations around specific defensive selections reveal something about the organizational filter at work. One evaluation in particular centered on a defensive lineman, whose most notable trait in the scouting process wasn't athletic profile. It was described in terms of a natural competitive intensity that shows up on every snap, rather than just the ones where the game is already being decided. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Players who compete at the same level regardless of the score and regardless of who's watching are the ones who set the standard in a locker room. They're also the ones who either find their footing and become identity pieces for a defense or run out of runway in a rebuild and become sources of frustration. The Raiders are clearly betting on the former. If they're right, and that pass rush energy is paired effectively with what's already on the roster, the combination could give this defense something it hasn't had in a very long time, a legitimate identity. What threads through all of these conversations consistently, and this is the thing I keep coming back to above everything else, is a very specific language around accountability. Not accountability as a press conference word. Not accountability as the thing you say when someone asks about culture and you need to sound credible. I mean accountability as a genuine organizational filter that shaped which human beings got invited into this building and which ones didn't. Multiple prospects, in independent conversations, hitting the same notes without being asked the same questions. Draft position doesn't earn you anything in a professional locker room. Respect is built through daily work that nobody is publicly tracking. Who you are when the cameras aren't present is who you actually are. When an entire incoming class is orbiting the same values independently, that's not a coincidence. That's a front office that has gotten extremely precise about the kind of person it will and won't invest in. Now let me be real with you, because I think I owe you that after everything I've just said. I've watched more off-seasons than I'd like to count turn into genuine October disappointments. Every team believes in its own rebuild while it's unfolding. The ones that don't make it, and most of them don't, aren't usually undone by talent gaps alone. They're undone by the first serious test of adversity. A rookie quarterback who throws a crushing interception in a fourth quarter that costs his team a game they needed. A 3-game losing streak that makes the outside narrative louder than the internal belief. Those moments always come. The question is never whether difficulty arrives. The question is whether the foundation you've built is honest enough and deep enough to absorb it and keep moving forward without fracturing. When a young quarterback goes cold for 3 weeks in November, when the offense disappears for a stretch, and the national media starts assembling the first draft of the "was he actually ready" story, the response of the coaching staff in that moment determines everything. Does the head coach protect his quarterback publicly while holding him accountable privately? Or does the organization quietly start distancing itself from its own guy because the pressure from outside becomes easier to follow than the vision it started with? Does the locker room hold when the record is bad and the outside noise is suffocating? Or do the veterans start tuning out and the whole thing dissolves before it ever had a chance to become something? These are the questions that no footage can answer in advance. No matter how genuine and revealing the inside access is, it cannot show you who these people are when 4 consecutive losses are sitting on the schedule and nothing is going right. What I can tell you is what I actually saw, and what I saw was alignment. Real alignment, not performed alignment. The head coach isn't selling the rebuild as closer than it is. The front office isn't pretending the last 2 decades of dysfunction didn't happen. The quarterback isn't performing humility for the room because the room expects it. He's describing specific concrete work he did to address specific concrete gaps he identified in himself. That combination, organizational honesty plus individual accountability plus a willingness to choose the hard path over the comfortable one at every single decision point, is something I almost never see from an NFL franchise during a rebuild. And when I do see it, it tends to mean something that the standings eventually confirm. So here's where I land. I don't know whether the Raiders win the AFC West this season. I don't know whether their rookie quarterback is going to handle a hostile environment in Week 11 the way the people inside that building believe he will. Those are things you cannot know yet, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling something. What I do know is that when I watch this entire process from the beginning of the coaching search through draft night, what I see is an organization that made the difficult call at every fork in the road. That built its infrastructure honestly before it needed to be. That put the right person in every seat that mattered before a single regular season snap was played. In this league, given the specific history this franchise has produced over the last 20 years, that's not a minor thing. That's actually the whole thing.